Russia is by no means anymore a communist country. China, to a large degree, particularly on its trade and economic side, uses whatever ideology suits it to achieve its aims, right? So, all of these sort of anti-communist tropes are simply a weaponization of this term.
Welcome to Redacted Conversations. I'm Clayton Morris. On this show, we invite whistleblowers, journalists, and interesting people on to share their stories. My guest today is Vanessa Beeley. She's an independent journalist based in Damascus, Syria. She covers some of the most important stories of our time in Syria, Ukraine, and China, and much more. And today, I think we're going to weave an interesting thread, how all of these things are interconnected in a way that the West just does not share with the public. Vanessa has been uncovering the lies and the propaganda surrounding the so-called Uighur genocide in China. And this will be our focus today, but as you'll see, this travels wider than just China. Vanessa, welcome to the show.
Hi, Clayton. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
Absolutely. I think this is going to be a very important conversation. And I want to say this sort of at the outset. All of you watching right now, please share this video with people in your family who might be ignorant on this subject. I'm going to learn a lot today. There are people, I'm sure, in your social circle, whether it's on Facebook or other social platforms, who just don't understand this topic. Please share this story with them today. We need to get this message out. So I want to start there, Vanessa. I want to start where most people are right now, where most people are in their frame of reference, which I think is fairly ignorant on this subject. And I don't mean this as a pejorative. I don't mean, I think that Western media like BBC, CNN, all of them have told us a story about China and the Uyghur oppression. So first, if we could do a little bit of role playing, if you could you explain where the Western media version of this story, where people are first, and then we're going to dive into the truth. So most people sort of sitting back on their weekend, what do most people think about what's happening in China?
Well, basically, the media consortium, of course, led by, as you mentioned, organizations like the BBC and CNN, that I consider to be nothing more than extensions of US and UK foreign policy and intelligence agency strategy globally. They will be telling you that China is committing a genocide. The word genocide is liberally being used at the moment. Against effectively the Turkestani population of the northwest of China, the Xinjiang province. And if you follow the BBC and CNN and affiliated media outlets, then you will believe that more than 1 million Uyghur minority civilians are incarcerated, that China is leading a cultural genocide that is also being one of the popular headlines in Western media, and that many of these so-called retraining, reintegration programs that China is running to prevent the radicalization of this Uyghur population are in fact detention camps, torture centers, etc. So effectively, what you have here is a genocide narrative that is being run across all media stations. And
I hear it constantly on CNN or BBC or other places. I see it in popular nonfiction, accounts of the lockdowns that unfolded during the pandemic, and people speaking out in support of China, and then the condemnation of those people who supported China, saying, how dare you stand with support China, given their oppression of these people. We hear it constantly.
Yeah, indeed. I think what people need to do, there are certain people that I would recommend following who have been looking into this for a lot longer than I have. Daniel Dumbrell, who's actually based inside China and has visited Xinjiang on a number of occasions. Brian Beletic, his channel is The New Atlas on YouTube, who is also an expert on kind of taking apart the Associated Press, BBC, CNN narratives. And I think this is what is very important for people to understand. the media has consistently lied to us. It lied to us about Iraq, about Libya, about Syria, about Latin America, now about Ukraine, about Russia. And I think we need to remember that they do effectively lie for a living, and that we should assume that any narrative that is being propagated by the mainstream media complex without deviation. If you look across every single media platform, they are all pretty much copy-paste telling the same story about China. At that point, I would be very suspicious. When you start to look into, for example, organizations like the World Uighur Congress and all their affiliates, you will see one common denominator, which is that they are funded by the National Endowments for Democracy, which we know to be a CIA outreach agent trying to effectively infiltrate target countries and to influence political opposition to the government that the US would like to remove. Of course, the other operative is US aid, but they tend to operate in remote agricultural areas and to take control of agricultural processes, etc., as they have done, of course, for years in Palestine, but also they have attempted that even here in Syria. So I think as soon as you see that these narratives are being created by organizations that are effectively funded by a CIA agency, they are then being fed to the media outlets that, as I have said, act as an extension of those intelligence agencies, the Mockingbird media, to then influence public opinion against a target nation. And I'd like to go into some depth, if I can, about one of the organizations that is instrumental in producing these narratives to just demonstrate how this propaganda doesn't only begin in China. It began a long time ago, even pre-Second World War, going forward into the regime change war in Syria, now the provocation against Russia in Ukraine, and then on to China, to show how America in particular, but I consider UK as part of that alliance, to protect their global supremacy and unipolarity. To go back to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who talked about in his book, The Grand Chessboard, talked about who controls Eurasia will control the Middle East and Africa. And of course, for the US, that means the resources of those countries. They don't care about the people of those countries, as I can talk about in Syria. They care about the resources and the positioning of those countries to protect their global supremacy, their global world domination. And so the importance here is what Brzezinski said. America must, or the United States must, protect its influence in Eurasia. It can't allow a country like Russia or China to gain primacy, because that is anathema. That's a threat to the US global power base.
So that's where it starts, even pre-World War II.
Yeah.
And the carving out of battle lines are drawn and the propaganda machine kicks into high gear. We've spoken on this show to ex-intelligence officials who talked us through exactly how stories are planted in the press via the CIA and other intelligence apparatus. And we just saw that, in fact, just this past week in Ukraine. We saw another story out of Mariupol where there was alleged bodies discovered in a basement. And this was propagated by the, quote, Mariupol mayor, who hasn't even been in that region for months. And immediately the Western press runs with this story. And then you start to unpack it and realize it's largely probably a giant piece of propaganda. Absolutely.
And I think the best way that I can demonstrate this is to show the audience a very clear example, particularly an organization which is behind a very recent report on the detention of Uyghur civilians and Uyghurs generally by the Chinese government. That was put out by an organization called the Victims of Communism, VOC. VOC was founded in 1993. It was authorized or endorsed by Bill Clinton at the time. If we look at the founders of the VOC, this is where it starts to get interesting. So the founders of this organization were Zbigniew Brzezinski, that I've just talked about, who wrote the Grand Chessboard, detailing the carving up of Russia, the surrounding of Russia, the containing of Russia, effectively. And of course, that was one of the reasons that the regime change war was led against Syria, because of Syria's historical connections to both the Soviet Union and then more recently, since 1991, with Russia itself, and now, of course, with President Putin. So Brzezinski was the number one founder. And of course, he was the architect of the war against Afghanistan. He admitted later that America had been funding and arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan prior to Russian intervention. So this was always the plan, to weaponize the Mujahideen. Now, among those Mujahideen, we should mention that there are Uighurs, Turkestani extremists that have been radicalized by Saudi Arabia and then infiltrated into Afghanistan to fight America's war against the Soviet Union, which effectively led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But then what becomes really interesting, the second founder is a guy called Lev Dobryansky. Now, Lev Dobryansky is of Polish origin, but Ukrainian nationality, with very, very clear links to the Nazi Party, the Banderite Party, the organization of Ukrainian nationalist Banderites. In 1939, when the first kind of Ukrainian National Information Service, so I guess a pre-runner to the SBU now, was established, he was their first director. He was an officer inside the CIA, previously, of course, the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. And I'm just reading a little bit from my notes here, but through his powerful connections in Congress, Pentagon, and the military-industrial complex, he played a pivotal role in forging the friendship between Nazi collaborators in the OUNB, the Banderite Nazi party followers of Stepan Bandera, who carried out some of the worst Nazi pogroms in the region. So he formed links between the OUNB and fervent anti-communists in the US. He was also on the board of the US World Anti-Communist League in the 70s, and again, that has a number of former Nazis on its board and among its members. He secured a US visa for Yaroslav Stetsko, founder of the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, again, an organization which has close ties, revolving door ties with the CIA, the State Department, the Pentagon, etc., and also absorbed some of the Nazi escapees after the Second World War. You know, Operation Paperclip is known to most people when the US basically imported Nazi engineers and scientists into the States. But he allowed Yaroslav Stetsko to enter the United States against even the advice of the CIA and the State Department because of the multiple crimes and the overseeing of mass pogroms against the Jews in Ukraine and in the Eastern European region. He was chairman of the ABN, the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, who had fought for the Nazis and dreamed of carving up the Soviet Union to regain territories that they had hoped to control as a result of World War II and that they'd hoped to regain during World War II. So this is a guy who had incredibly tight links to various Nazi organizations. He became an advisor to President Reagan. His daughter also, Paula, later became a primary advisor to Reagan. Reagan sent him to the Bahamas, many believe on a sort of drug running, drug trafficking, money laundering operation during the Iran-Contra crisis. So this is for me, the most interesting founder of this organization. There are others, and perhaps you can, I can take you through that, and then I can show how it top down filters down into American constitutional influence. And effectively, these are the people pushing these genocide narratives and paying lawyers to basically take it through into Congress as law, and then to impose sanctions against these nations that are being accused of genocide.
I want to get to some of those people. I think for our audience, I want to figure out, so we hear these Western stories, these fake news stories that are being planted by these guys. Why do we not get any sort of pushback from, I mean, we have few independent journalists. You're doing, yeoman's work getting this story out there. There's others who are trying to get in there and get this story out there, but they are up against a massive behemoth of a machine that keeps them from getting the news. So we're all ingesting the story that Uyghurs are being oppressed. There's internment camps, there's conversion, there's sterilization happening. Millions of people are being killed. And it seems to me like something we should be able to disprove this very, very easily.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, you have to look at who is producing these narratives. I mean, the most recent narrative was produced by a guy called Adrian Zenz, who works on the China studies part of the VOC. Now, Adrian Zenz can hardly be described as objective. He believes that he has a mission from God to bring an end to communism. And here, I just want to point out the ridiculousness of this communist trope, right? I mean, Russia is by no means anymore a communist country. China, to a large degree, particularly on its trade and economic side, uses whatever ideology suits it to achieve its aims, right? So, all of these sort of anti-communist tropes are simply a weaponization of this term, which has been used to gaslight American, UK, and EU publics for decades into believing that everything communist is bad and anything that is labeled communist is bad, right? And authoritarian and tyrannical.
It really comes down to money then, right? It's about economic hegemony, right? The U.S. dollar as the reserve digital currency or the reserve currency of the world, and that is under threat.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can just come back to this Adrian Zenz, and all of this is verifiable. People can go to the websites themselves and check all this information for themselves. So Zenz believes that he has a mission from God to bring an end to communism. So almost immediately you have to start questioning the guy's objectivity. Am I as qualified as a China expert like Zenz? Yes, I am, because Zenz has only been to Xinjiang province once on holiday in 2007. He's totally reliant on open source information. He's the Bellingcat of China, right? If people don't know who Bellingcat is an intelligence agency, NATO affiliated agency, funded organization that was heavily weaponized against Syria to produce the narratives like the chemical weapon attacks based on open source information. Of course, we know later from UK Foreign Office leaked documents that open source means UK Foreign Office and media controlled information. We know that the BBC and other media organizations were paid to be on the ground to train citizen journalists to pick witnesses for stories that corroborated UK foreign intelligence agenda inside Syria. And this is a very similar operation. Zenz is there to provide the evidence that corroborates the propaganda that the West needs to demonize and criminalize China. And of course, we have to remember where Xinjiang is placed. It's the northwest of China. And it's also important to point out the fact that the Uighur extremists, as I've said, that have been trained and radicalized in various countries like Pakistan and Iraq and Afghanistan by Saudi Arabia, are on the borders of China, but they're also fighting in Syria. In northwest Syria, we still have between 10 and 20,000 Uighur extremists, known to be some of the most brutal and some of the most sectarian factions operating inside Idlib under the control of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And they have always fought alongside ISIS and Al-Qaeda inside Syria, in Pakistan, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. So when we consider what China is doing, when it talks about re-education programs, of course, immediately you use the word program, people start saying, see, look, they're brainwashing, they're detaining, they're torturing. Because, why? Because we are used to what the West does.
Right.
The West had Guantanamo Bay. The West is funding UAE detention centers in southern Yemen and training them in torture procedures like waterboarding and electrocution, etc. Right?
The West had Japanese internment camps during World War II.
Yeah, the West really is it's the world expert in torture, to be honest, and so are its allies, whether that is Israel, whether that's Saudi Arabia. They have the worst record of human rights globally, but I don't see any sanctions against Saudi Arabia. I don't see any mass formation of organizations to criminalize Saudi Arabia. Why? Because Saudi Arabia is an ally of the West. It's useful to the West. Okay. China is the number one enemy of the West, although the West is heavily embedded inside China. This is the dichotomy of these arguments, because the US and the West will exploit a country until that country becomes too powerful, and then it has to be brought down. All right? It's not there to engage with a country, to form partnerships with a country, trade, economic, political partnerships, military partnerships even. It's not there to do that. It's there to secure its own supremacy only. That's the bottom line, right? And so Zentz is effectively the guy providing the majority of these narratives and the majority of the evidence for these narratives. Now, for the most recent one, this police detention center.
This is a BBC piece?
Yeah, it's a BBC piece. The BBC lead the media consortium that is taking in these narratives and regurgitating them, okay? The BBC has very recently, John Sudworth of the BBC has very recently been kicked out of China for his role in doing this. And of course, it's being played in the West as, oh my God, China's cracking down on press freedom. No, it isn't. It's doing what every country would do. Like, all of us are being demonized because we're bringing some truth to the Ukrainian conflict. We are being demonized. RT has been written out of existence on the internet in the West, right? So China is doing exactly what the West is doing. It's protecting its national security. And the BBC is one of the biggest threats in the world right now to any country's national security if that country comes into the crosshairs of the US and the UK. So China has every right to kick the BBC out. I'm surprised it didn't do it any sooner. And so Zentz is producing this latest report based on hacking police computers. So again, here we start to come into this open source information. There was evidence that I saw from somebody on Twitter, and I did double check it, that shows that there is a very high likelihood that Zentz and a number of his colleagues were doctoring these reports to make them more suitable for the corroboration of the agenda of the CIA, the Pentagon, the US administration under Biden, et cetera, et cetera.
What did the report say?
Basically, they were just talking about the detention of Uyghurs in these police stations. They were making claims of torture and illegal detention, et cetera, et cetera. What he actually doctored, I can't actually remember, but I can certainly send you afterwards the link to the Twitter feed where they talk about exactly what he changed and how he interfered with the documentation that he managed to get through a hacking process. Now, it's funny, when we as independent journalists receive hacked information that exposes the British government or the US government crimes, for example, WikiLeaks, right? we're criminalized. And in the case of Julian Assange, he's in prison and he is being tortured and he is in danger of death if he is extradited to the United States. But it's okay if their side does it against China, right? I mean, it's just layer after layer after layer of hypocrisy, to be honest.
Yeah, the hypocrisy is very, very strong. So, this piece called The Xinjiang Police Files Inside a Chinese Internment Camp. And so he hasn't gone there. He's gotten this information allegedly from hacked computers. Your evidence shows that he's doctored the documents to make them seem more salacious somehow. And what do they specifically say? Do they talk about? I mean, what exactly do they talk about is happening inside of these internment camps?
Well, I mean, they just refer to brutality, to torture, to, as I said, internment of Uyghurs without any reason. Now, the Uyghurs themselves have carried out numerous terrorist attacks, both on mainland China, in Bangkok, in Kunduz, in Afghanistan, in 2015, I think it was, when they killed over 100 Shia Muslims in a bombing. The responsibility was claimed by ISIS, but it was an actual Uyghur suicide bomber that carried out the attack. In Syria alone, as I said, they have carried out numerous atrocities against civilian populations. And so this organization, which has been radicalized and weaponized, going back, by the way, to the 1920s, even actually early or late 19th century, the Germans, Otto von Bismarck, advocated the weaponization of the Turkestani Islamic extremists alongside in alliance with the Ottoman Empire against the British and the French. So this isn't something that is new, right?
Right.
This is something that has been ongoing for centuries. Well, not centuries, centuries.
So they are radicalized. They've been in Afghanistan. They've been carrying out terrorist attacks. The Western media narrative is that China has been surveilling them. I just saw a story last night about the surveillance inside these internment camps, or they're surveilling minority Uyghurs throughout that region, where they have cameras in every crevice and every corridor of the streets and so forth. And that's China is watching them very, very closely. They are sterilizing them. They are trying to convert them religiously. That's what we're being told. So what is the truth there? What is actually happening there?
Well, this is where it gets interesting, because when I really started to unravel this, what I found was, on one side, you have all the anti-China narratives that I have said are universally feeding into the NED. So they're all funded top down by the NED, so by the CIA, okay? On the other side, you have various Uyghur statements pushing back against the BBC, against all of these organizations, okay? You have Muslim organization statements saying that all of these narratives are not true, that they have visited Xinjiang and that they have found it to be not only peaceful, but they find what China is trying to do. They are basically trying to economically help the Uyghurs. Yes, there is an element of trying to prevent radicalization, but I think here we need to remember that in World War II, for example, the MI6 in the UK was summarily executing anyone they thought was a Nazi spy. Right. MI6 had its rendition and torture. I'll mention Julian Assange again. So if you had factions of Al-Qaeda in America, close to New York City, for example, would you not be expecting the government to try at least to run programs to de-radicalize or to prevent the radicalization of these ghettos or these communities? I mean, wouldn't that be expected?
And they're doing that. We know that's the case. We know there's infiltration by the FBI into these groups. In fact, we just saw in Michigan with the alleged kidnapping plot. We saw their involvement, their deep involvement in that, for sure.
Exactly. So, I think what China is doing is really eminently sensible. It knows what the West is doing. And it's not as if we don't have historical precedents. I mean, it's all the West has done.
Right.
Throughout its existence as empire, that's all it's done, is to subvert and subjugate target nations in one way, shape, or form, either economically, politically, militarily, right? And of course, what do these narratives allow? And that's what we're seeing now, are tougher sanctions against China, just as we saw the ramping up of sanctions against Russia at the start of the conflict, or the special operations in Ukraine. This is all playbook, right? This is what we see all the time. I'm not saying that I agree with all China's policies, but my job as a journalist is to expose what my government is doing globally that is going to create seismic changes and devastation in the world. And if we go to war with China, that's beyond Russia. Biden is building up in Taiwan. They've been sending weapons in there for some time. So effectively, China is surrounded, just as Russia was, by American defense biolabs. It has had subversion in Hong Kong. Going back to 1989, Tiananmen Square was a color revolution instigated by George Soros. China kicked him out of China at that point, right? And at that point, actually, the CIA controlled instigators of what happened in Tiananmen Square were brought back to the United States and to the EU for protection under Operation Yellowbird, which for me just strikes me, even their wording in the CIA operation is racist towards China. Operation Yellowbird.
Right.
And this is the thing, they're relying on decades of reds under the bed, McCarthyite demonization of anything related to communism for us to be triggered immediately into thinking, yeah, China, maybe they were wrong on Syria, but on China, we don't understand China, And it was the same with Russia.
They have such a long history of lying to us. Why do we continue to believe them now? We have Mike Pompeo telling us that they have training programs on lying at the CIA. That's what they would do. And he was proud of that, right? That's what they are.
Yeah.
So we have a long history of lies. Why, we're now going to believe them, and so many people do. It's because we don't have anybody in this province, right? In China, we don't have any other voices there. We're not hearing that. The Western media is not really interested in covering that. We thought we might get some answers this past week from the UN and the UN rights chief. So talk a little bit about that. So there was all of this pressure. United Nations is going to go there.
Extraordinary.
We're going to go and see it. We're going to go and see it. And then what happens?
I think actually, I don't know if her report has been published yet, but she's getting terrorized on Twitter. I had a look yesterday, and they were attacking her or trying to influence her even before she went, which to me is another alarm bell. If this genocide is really ongoing, why are they so desperately trying to make sure she comes back with the right story?
Right.
And another minor thing, I actually looked at tourism in Xinjiang. There are dozens of tour agencies that will take you for trips around Xinjiang. Okay, that's a minor thing, but it's still stuck in my mind.
Right. If there's a genocide happening, as you would, you don't have tour buses, you don't have hop on, hop off buses stopping for lunch.
Exactly.
Right.
And the extraordinary thing is, again, coming back to the media, if you go back to 2016, in 2014, the BBC produced an article talking about the extremism of the Uyghurs, the crimes they had carried out globally. In 2016, Time wrote an article about the real threat to China was from the Uyghur extremism. then suddenly we have this hiatus where it all disappears. And this, again, is very similar to me what's happening now in Ukraine. In
Absolutely.
2014 to 2016, the media was speaking very openly, big headlines about the rise of Nazism and fascism in Ukraine. Suddenly, no, Azov are not Nazi. Russians are the real Nazis, right?
It disappears.
We've had a complete flip. Yeah, it's just disappeared. So, this is my point. We're all being compartmentalized and managed by media. And that's where, I haven't been to Xinjiang. I would really like to go and see for myself. And by the way, just coming back to one of the other narratives, which is this cultural genocide narrative, which was talking about the destruction of Uighur mosques, right, in the Xinjiang province. What actually happened was China pushed UNESCO, and they really had to push to preserve Uyghur cultural heritage. So it's China pushing UNESCO while the West is saying China is destroying Uyghur cultural heritage. It's pushing UNESCO to save Uyghur national heritage. It's proud of Uyghur national heritage, right?
It's unbelievable. And I think what's lost is the nuance, right? It's very easy to just, we need a bad guy, and we need supportive pieces of journalism, supportive pieces of this narrative to have good guy versus bad guy. And you're right, in Ukraine, it was all over the place. We've covered it on our show extensively, the headlines about Ukraine's Nazi problem. Well before. And then just as February unfolds, those articles just start disappearing. They start, no more discussion of that. You can go to the U.S. State Department's website and read about the SBU in Ukraine as violators of human rights as late as 2021, right on their website. Torture, making people disappear. That's on the U.S. State Department's website. And now something changed in 4 months. They're all good guys now. This is what we're being told and fed.
Yeah, exactly. And if I can just come back to this whole network again.
Yeah, so tie this together for us with these guys.
Yeah, so you have Adrian Zenz, basically, who's an analyst for the VOC that I've mentioned, that was established by Brzezinski, Lev Dobryansky, who has ties to Ukrainian Nazi organizations, and his offspring, by the way, his grandson, is now in Ukraine working to produce propaganda against Russia there. So, the dynasty has continued. And of course, post Second World War, if people watch Oliver Stone's Ukraine on Fire, they will understand how the US effectively protected the Nazi elements, Operation Gladio, and then dispersed them across Europe for future use as guerrilla warfare against, both on a propaganda and a military perspective, against the Soviet Union and then against Russia. But if we so look at Zenz, who works for VOC, he also works for an organization called the New Lines Institute, funded by NED. He is also an analyst for the Jamestown Foundation, revolving door with the CIA, State Department, Pentagon, military-industrial complex. Who are the directors at Jamestown Foundation? Michael Hayden, former CIA director, former director of the NSA when Snowden was exposing the surveillance controversy. He was a fan or an advocate of torture in Guantanamo. And by the way, in Guantanamo, there were a number of Uighur extremists that were being tortured by the US in Guantanamo.
Wow, I did not know that. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, there were up to, I think, 22 extremists, Uighur extremists, actually held and tortured in Guantanamo.
Wow. and we get to lecture the world on torture, right?
Yeah, but right. I mean that's the ultimate, really, for me. When I look at what's been done to Syria over the last 11 years, the West doesn't have a moral fig leaf to stand on. It really doesn't,
Right.
And then another on the board of directors of Jamestown Foundation is General Breedlove, who was the former NATO commander, and also who since 2014 has been pushing for military escalation and intervention in Ukraine, among other things. Obviously, his history as commander of NATO. So this just gives you an indication of the powerhouse that is behind these narratives. And, you know, this, to some extent, this is normal. I mean, Syria, the kind of billionaire, not-for-profit industrial complex behind the war against Syria that I've written extensively about, as have people like Cory Morningstar or Whitney Webb, etc. But when it comes to China, you have the big guns, right? Even bigger than those that are being deployed against Russia, to be honest. Because China is the number one obstacle to global primacy for the US. Basically, whatever you think of China, that's the bottom line. And I, you know, personally, I have some problems with China, for example, supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia to be used against the Yemenis for some time. And the fact that it has effectively endorsed UN Resolution 2216, which continues the blockade and siege of 23 million Yemenis. So I have myself questions to raise about China, but on the side of the narratives being used to effectively subvert and impose sanctions, so to economically wage war or declare war against China, I have issues with what the West is saying. I have big issues with it. And my fear is that we are being led to war against both Russia and China. We know that NATO member states provoked Russia for a long time into finally leading this special operation into Ukraine. And now we see Biden effectively upping the ante against China by saying he will defend Taiwan if China invades Taiwan. We know in Thailand, there have been efforts to subvert even Thailand, right? Little Thailand.
Right.
CIA operations. And again, Thailand it's trying to push through a law to kick out Western NGOs because it can see what's going on. And of course, now you have Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International pointing their fingers at Thailand and saying, how dare you? How dare you kick the CIA out of your country? How dare you defend your national security?
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
I think that's where we are right now. We've been fed this lie about what's happening in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs. And that might not be enough for the West to rally to support some sort of a war against China, right? That's one piece of it. See, they're carrying out a genocide against these people. Then we have the Taiwan piece. Then we have the Thailand piece, and so all of these pieces.
You had Hong Kong, remember?
And Hong Kong, right?
Yeah. You know, which again was backed by all the same characters, and all of the kind of mock tribunals that you have. I think there's been 2 against China reference Uyghur genocide. All the same characters who were involved in Syria and previously pro-Israel and Palestine, etc. So all the time you'll see the same individuals running the same operations. I mean, for example, as I mentioned, the UK Foreign Office document leaks. You had a guy called Alistair Harris who headed up an organization called ARK, Analysis, Research and Knowledge, ARK Group. ARK Group, sorry. Who was involved in the creation of the White Helmets and various other intelligence-linked organizations inside Syria to effectively provide the propaganda, but also to provide protection or whitewashing for the terrorist groups. He's doing the same in Yemen. He did the same in the Balkans. He's running the same operations in Lebanon to subvert intelligence, security, military, and governmental institutions. So you will, when you start to dig, you'll see all the same organizations. And I call it the Hydra because you cut one head off, another one grows back, right? So the same people will leave one company because it's kind of become a bit tainted and people are a bit sharp to what's going on. So they'll leave that operation, they'll set up another one. And it takes people a while to figure out, oh, but these are the same people. They stopped this one and now they've started this one. So it is literally a Hydra for me. It's like, as I said, you know, you cut off one head, another one grows back, because there is infinite resources behind this. This is what is very important to understand. The people that brought you the incubator babies,
in Iraq,
the Benghazi rape, the in Libya, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, second time round,
right.
9/11. The people that brought you the chemical weapon attacks in Syria are bringing you the kind of the war crime stories from Ukraine. They're bringing you the Uighur genocide stories in China, right? So
they're all lies.
People.
Yeah, they're all lies. And we're eating it up. And the Western media is running with it, whether you're in Portugal or other parts of Europe or all in the United States. You'll change your Twitter handle to have a Ukrainian flag emoji because you're gobbling up this narrative.
Absolutely. And I think what's kind of what I found very scary was when the operation in Ukraine began, how rapidly people, the needle on the hatometer just went against Russian people. They became overnight the Untermenschen, right? Which is, and I'm seeing something very similar in China. People have been programmed, and I prefer to say gaslighted, for so many years. Go and read William Blum about the Reds under the beds and how this whole anti-communist narrative was created to effectively demonize any countries that were against the US. Syria, as I said before, suffered more than 75 years of interference by CIA and MI6 since its independence from French mandate in 1946. Why? Predominantly because every government that came in with any kind of socialist program was deemed to be communist, or was deemed to be connected to the communism of Soviet Union. And of course, Syria has a long history of collaboration with the Soviet Union and with Russia. So for that reason, and Syria is pivotal to supremacy in the Middle East, right? Because of its geographical location, its resources, and so on. Its location on the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, Assad's 5Cs project that he was working on prior to 2011. So Syria represents, while they know they have to control Eurasia to have control of the Middle East and Africa, where all the resources are, Syria is pivotal to that, right? But it was connected or linked to the Soviet Union. It's linked to communism. And another thing that I really want to point out is we've seen the weaponization of Eastern extremism. Now we're seeing the weaponization of Western extremism, Nazism. And we're seeing them working together in Ukraine. That should send a message, right? Because we're seeing Al-Qaeda and ISIS working and collaborating with Zionists and with Nazis in Ukraine. So there you have the three streams of extremism in our world today working together in Ukraine. So the two ends of the spectrum have been brought together. And that for me is a really, really frightening conclusion to arrive at.
Good luck finding that in the Western media anywhere. And that's why we wanted to have you on the show. I want to get you out of here on this, Vanessa, which is, and I'm glad you brought this up, and I feel the same way. I have friends in China, and I've spoken to them about the lockdowns in Shanghai and other areas, and they were demoralized. And it's there's certain things in China that I absolutely don't agree with, just like what you said. But the idea of genocide, to my mind, I have not seen any evidence of this. Is it safe to say there's been zero evidence of this charge?
From my perspective, from the research I've done, and from speaking to people like Brian Valetic, the New Atlas, Daniel Dumbrell on Twitter, as I said, he's spent extensive time in Xinjiang. From reading Uighur statements, from reading Muslim Congress statements, I think we have to err on the side of it's not happening.
Wow. That's a powerful. I mean, it really is. I mean, and I'm glad you're on here to shed light on this story. I think it's an incredibly important story, and there's so much ignorance around this. So I just want to thank you for this great work and bringing this to us. And we will continue to cover this story here on the show. And as you uncover more information about this, we would welcome you back anytime to go even deeper. And we're still waiting on this UN report, right? So we'll have some more information of that too coming up, right?
Well, actually, I mean, this reminds me a lot of the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. If you remember, after Duma 2018, and there was all the controversy about the fact that the acting investigative officers did not agree with the final conclusions of the OPCW, which suggested that the OPCW was compromised and corrupted by those that are influencing it, namely the countries that want to criminalize Syria that are in control of UN organizations, the US, the UK, Canada, et cetera, et cetera. So this reminds me very much of that on a kind of, not a lesser scale, but she's one person. Right. So it reminds me of the delay in getting the OPCW reports out. And I think this is a lot of pressure coming on from behind the scenes to make sure that that report complies with the narratives and the propaganda. And my heart kind of goes out to honest officials like Carla Del Ponte before, who, when the Khan Shaykhun chemical attack happened in 2013, just as the UN inspectors arrived in Damascus, lo and behold, the Syrian government carries out a chemical weapon attack. And it was Carla Del Ponte, then with the UN, who said she didn't believe it came from Syrian government. So every now and then you get honest officials, right? But I think the chances of them being able to be honest, just as we saw the suppression of the OPCW inspectors and the threats against them actually for coming out and saying, but this isn't what we said, reference Syria and the Duma alleged chemical attack. Here you have Michelle Bachelet, who appeared to have a very good rapport with Chinese officials, who I think was taken to Xinjiang quite openly. And now there's this kind of black hole and no report yet, and just huge amounts. I mean, they are literally dogpiling on her. Every Guardian article, every BBC article, well, you better write what we want you to say, basically, is what they're saying.
Yeah. Don't base it on the evidence. Don't base it on the evidence of what you saw. Just take our narrative and print that, please. Yes.
Yeah, but that's exactly what they're saying.
Yeah.
If you read through the headlines and if you read through what they're saying, that is effectively what they're saying. So there's no honesty involved. This is what I'm saying. If these countries and their media wanted peace, the war in Ukraine never needed to have happened. Mm-hmm. If NATO had respected the Minsk agreements, if NATO had prevented the war against Donetsk and Luhansk, the genocide in Donetsk and Luhansk for 8 years, if America had not been involved in the 2014 NATO coup in Ukraine, which then emboldened the Nazi elements in Ukraine, right? If none of that had happened, we wouldn't be at war, but it did happen and it continues to happen. And at some point, the public needs to start saying, no, enough of this, not another 40 billion. What are we going to do now? Send 40 billion to Taiwan? Mm-hmm.
I hope. And that's why we do this show. And I think hopefully, even if in a small way, we can help people, elect an official that's not going to send money to Ukraine, not going to push this narrative. Then I think we can get there.
Thank you for doing what you do, because there's so few decent platforms now to really get an honest report out there. And as I say to everyone, don't take my word for it. Go and look at the information, look at the evidence yourself. I'm only doing what you can do. Exactly.
And bringing this to us. Vanessa, I want to thank you so much for your time today. And you have a great Telegram channel where you provide a lot of great context and information. It's just Vanessa Beeley on Telegram, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so follow you there. We'll link it up in the show description below. And I want to thank you so much for joining us today to share this story with the world.
Thank you so much for having me on, Clayton, and really thank you for what you're doing. It's really appreciated by independent journalists and by the public as well.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your great work. Stay safe. Thank you, Vanessa. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
And thanks to all of you. We'll see you next time.